I told a story about my mom leaving me this note that I was supposed to find after she died, but I'd found it before she died. She left it in a brass pot. And there is a story called The Nurse and the Brass Pot. So I'm going to share that story with you now. A nurse was in her small home, and there was very little food remaining in the cupboards. She gathered the last of the food together for one last meal, and she took the brass pot that she had and took it down to the river to collect some water to boil up the meal. And she put the brass pot on the river bank and thought, well, I'm down here. I might as well go for a dip in the river. So she went for a swim, came back out, and she opened the brass pot to collect some water. And to her horror, there was a viper, a venomous snake, inside the brass pot. So she quickly closed the lid. And she took the brass pot up to her house, and she closed the windows, and she opened the brass pot. And instead of there being a viper, a poisonous snake in there, there was instead a necklace of gemstones, a necklace of pearls or gemstones. And that's the story of the nurse and the brass pot. You might wonder what she was doing with the viper. And I've reflected a little bit on that story. I'd be very interested in what you see in it. Nurse, in days gone by, people weren't called caregivers. They were called nurses. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that she was caring for perhaps a relative, a husband, somebody who had died. And because she was at the end of her means, there was nothing left in the cupboards. That perhaps she looked after that person right to the end of their life and right to the end of her means. And so there wasn't much left for her. And so the viper was an invitation. And yet, when she took it back up to the house, it was instead a necklace of gems. It turned out to be something quite different than she thought. I love that story because it feels like many folk tales. It was true to my caregiving experience. That sometimes we give and we put out and we, through empathy, go to the end of our means to help somebody leave in a good way through a difficult circumstance without perhaps the resources or support that we should have and we need. And we take ourselves into a very vulnerable circumstance because we see that person's suffering and pain, and we go further and further out on a limb until there's not much left for us. And I know there's so much more talk about self-care, but unless you have support, it's hard to take care of yourself when somebody has a serious illness and you have an empathetic connection with them. So sometimes we do go to this place where there's not much left for us, either energetically or financially. And we feel perhaps that that's the end of our lives. And yet, in it, there is a gift.